"You're fired." The words landed flat, cold, final. A few quiet chuckles slipped across the glass-walled conference room as Daniel Hayes stood there, hands steady at his sides, eyes lifting slowly to meet hers. Victoria, Kane didn't blink. Tailored suit, perfect posture, the kind of authority that didn't ask twice. She had already moved on, already flipping the page, already erasing him like a number on a spreadsheet. "Any questions?" she asked, voice smooth, distant. Daniel shook his head once. "No, ma'am." 3 words. Simple. Controlled. The room expected more. A plea. A reaction. Something louder. But Daniel Hayes had learned a long time ago that dignity doesn't raise its voice. It just stands there, quiet, unshaken. He turned, collected the small cardboard box HR had placed by his chair, and walked toward the door without looking back. Behind him, someone whispered, "That guy didn't even fight it." Another voice answered, "They never do." The door clicked shut with a soft, hollow finality. Outside, the hallway buzzed with fluorescent lights and low conversations, but none of it touched him. Because just 12 hours earlier, under a sky that refused to stop pouring, Daniel had stood on the side of Route 17 with rain soaking through his jacket, his hands deep under the hood of a stalled black sedan. "You don't have to stay," the woman had said, arms crossed tight against the cold. Her voice edged with impatience, not fear. "Tow truck's already on the way." Daniel didn't look up. "Tow truck's about 40 minutes out," he said calmly. "You'll be home in 10 if this holds." She studied him then, not with gratitude, but with distance, like someone used to being helped but never needing to remember who helped. Thunder rolled somewhere far behind them. The smell of wet asphalt hung thick in the air. He tightened one last connection, wiped his hands on a worn cloth, and stepped back. "Try it now." The engine turned, then caught. Smooth. Reliable. She exhaled, surprised, but it didn't soften her tone. "How much?" Daniel shook his head. "Nothing." A pause. She frowned slightly. People don't usually do that. He met her eyes for the first time, steady, unhurried. Everyone deserves to get home safe. For a moment, something shifted behind her gaze. Not warmth. Not yet. Just hesitation. Then it was gone. She got into the car, shut the door, and drove off without another word. Back in the present, Daniel stepped out into the parking lot, the early morning sun cutting sharp lines across the concrete. He set the box down on the hood of his old pickup, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes just for a second. Inside that building, decisions were made in seconds. Lives rearranged between sips of coffee. But out here, the air felt different. Quieter. Tua. He picked up the box again, opened the truck door, and paused. Because somewhere deep in the rhythm of that morning, something hadn't finished yet. Not the story. Not the truth. Not the silence that was still waiting to fall. The truck engine rattled softly as Daniel Hayes pulled into the gravel driveway just past 7:30, the early lights stretching long shadows across the small white house that had seen better years but still held together like everything else in his life, quiet and resilient. And before he even turned off the ignition, the front door swung open and Lily ran out barefoot, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Daddy, you are late," she called, half laughing, half worried, and he smiled. In a way that hid everything. "Only by 5 minutes," he said, stepping out and kneeling just enough to meet her eyes. Plenty of time to beat the morning bell, and she studied him the way children do when they feel something is off but cannot name it. "Did you fix the big machine again?" she asked, and Daniel nodded. Something like that. 3 simple answers, 3 steady beats, and then he picked up her bag, walked her to the passenger side, and opened the door like it mattered, because to him it always did. And as she climbed in, she whispered, "You look tired," and he replied softly, "Just a long night, and nothing more, because some truths do not need to be spoken to be carried." And the drive to school was quiet except for the hum of the old engine and the soft tapping of her fingers against the window, sunlight flickering across her face as they passed the same rows of maple trees. And when they pulled up to the curb, she did not rush out right away. She turned back, hesitated, and said, "We're still go to the science fair on Friday, right?" And Daniel paused just long enough to feel the weight of that question settle somewhere deeper than his pocket, deeper than the box sitting on the seat beside him. "We will be there," he said, steady, certain, even if he did not yet know how. And she smiled, satisfied with that answer, because children believe in promises more than plans. And she stepped out, waving once before disappearing into the building, and Daniel sat there a moment longer, hands resting on the wheel, the silence wrapping around him like something familiar. Not empty, just still like the breath before something changes. And inside his chest there was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet recalibration, the kind that happens when life removes something and waits to see what you do next. And he reached over, opened a cardboard box, and looked at what remained of his job. A name badge, a pair of worn gloves, a photo of Lily taped to the inside flap. And he took the photo out, brushed his thumb gently across it, and let out a slow breath because respect, he knew, was not something a title could give or take away. It was something you carried, even when everything else was gone, and somewhere across town, in a glass office high above the streets, a woman who had signed his name away without a second glance was about to learn that some decisions do not end when the paper is filed. They begin when the truth finally catches up, and the morning, calm and ordinary on the surface, had already started to shift. Across town, the top floor of Kane Global Technologies was already awake, glass walls catching the morning sun like a mirror that reflected power back at itself. And inside her office, Victoria Kane stood still for just a moment longer than usual, a tablet in her hand, her schedule already packed down to the minute. "We have the investor call at 9, the restructuring review at 10, her assistant said, voice precise, efficient, and Victoria nodded once. "Cancel nothing," she replied. "We stay." On track, 3 short commands, clean and controlled, the kind that built empires and erased hesitation. And yet, as she stepped toward her desk, something lingered, something small and inconvenient, like a thought that refused to be filed away, because when she reached for her coffee, her hand paused just slightly, and for a second, the sound of rain echoed somewhere far behind the quiet hum of the office, a memory not loud enough to demand attention, but not quiet enough to disappear, and she set the cup down without drinking. "Pull the footage from last night," she said suddenly, and her assistant blinked. "From the parking garage," Victoria added, tone unchanged, as if the request had always been part of the plan, and minutes later, the screen lit up with grainy black and white frames, timestamps ticking forward, a black sedan stalled, a figure stepping out, another approaching, and Victoria leaned forward just slightly, not because she was unsure, but because something in her chest had shifted into focus. And there he was, the man from the roadside, jacket soaked, movement steady, hands working under the hood with quiet certainty, no rush, no performance, just intention, and the footage had no sound, but she could almost hear it, the rain, the silence between them, the kind of silence that carried weight, instead of emptiness, and she watched as he stepped back, as the engine came back to life, as he refused whatever she had offered, and then the frame froze on his face for just a fraction longer as he turned toward the light, and something inside her tightened. Not guilt, not yet, just recognition, and then the system tagged him automatically, employee ID flashing in the corner of the screen, Daniel Hayes, Maintenance Division, and the name landed differently this time, not as a line on a report, but as a person she had already crossed without seeing, and she straightened slowly, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Run his file," she said, quieter now, and her assistant hesitated, sensing something unspoken. "Is there a problem?" she asked carefully, and Victoria shook her head once. "No," she said, but the word did not settle the way it usually did, because for the first time that morning, the structure she trusted, the system that filtered people into numbers and outcomes, had missed something, and she could feel it, not as a mistake yet, but as a gap. And gaps in her world were never small. They widened, they exposed, they demanded to be filled. And as the file loaded onto her screen, pages of quiet contributions, late hours, problem reports solved without escalation, things no one applauded because they simply worked. Victoria leaned back, slightly, her fingers resting against the edge of the desk, and the room, still bright, still efficient, seemed to hold its breath for just a moment, because somewhere between last night's rain and this morning's decision, something had been overlooked, and the kind of oversight she had built her career avoiding was now sitting right in front of her, waiting, patient, undeniable. The file did not close when she expected it to. That was the first thing Victoria Kane noticed, because usually a name became a conclusion, a clean decision, a line crossed and archived, but Daniel Hayes did not settle that way, his record stretching back years with a pattern that did not match the narrative she had signed off on. He stayed late on system failures. Her assistant read quietly, scrolling, volunteered for overnight maintenance during winter outages, declined overtime bonuses. Twice, Victoria said nothing, just watched, her fingers resting still against the glass surface of her desk. 3 facts, simple, unremarkable on their own, but together they formed something else, something harder to dismiss, and she leaned forward slightly. "Pull incident reports from last quarter," she said, and within seconds another set of files appeared, timestamps, notes, signatures from supervisors who barely remembered the nights they went home early because someone else had stayed behind. And there it was again, his name, not highlighted, not celebrated, just present, consistent, like a quiet line that held everything else together without asking to be seen. And the room felt different now, not louder, but heavier, like the air had thickened with something unspoken. And Victoria exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition that something inside her process had missed a layer. And that layer had a name. And that name had a life she had reduced to a decision in. Under 10 seconds, and she stood up, walking toward the window where the city stretched out below in neat, controlled lines. Everything moving, everything measurable, everything predictable except the memory that kept returning whether she allowed it or not. The rain, the man, the way he had not asked who she was, the way he had not adjusted his tone. Not once, and she replayed it now, without the storm, without the distraction, just the words, "Everyone deserves to get home safe." And something in that sentence pressed against the structure she trusted, because it was not about transactions, not about leverage or return. It was about something she had not needed to define in years. And behind her, her assistant spoke again, softer this time. "There is more." And Victoria turned. "What kind of more?" she asked, and the screen shifted to a final document, one she had not seen before, flagged but never escalated, a systems audit from 8 months ago, a failure that could have cost the company millions, maybe more, and the resolution was logged under his name. Completed overnight. No escalation, no report beyond the required line, just a signature and a timestamp at 3:20 in the morning, and Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation, because this was not just a missed detail. This was a foundation she had removed without understanding what it supported, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, waiting, and she spoke again. Slower now. "Why was this not flagged?" And her assistant hesitated. "Because he did not report up the chain," she said, and Victoria nodded once, the answer landing with a quiet weight. Because the system had not failed, it had simply done what it was designed to do, overlook what does not demand attention. And in that moment, the room did not feel like a place of control anymore. It felt like a place where something important had been missed, something that did not raise its voice, did not ask for recognition, but held value all the same. And Victoria stood there, looking at the screen, at the name she had already erased. And for the first time that morning, she did not reach for the next task. She did not move forward because the passages caught up, and it was not asking for permission to be ignored. The office no longer felt like a place where decisions ended. It felt like a place where they echoed, and Victoria Kane stood in the center of it, still composed, but no longer untouched by what she had just seen. "Get me his termination file," she said, her voice quieter now, not weaker, just more deliberate, and her assistant moved quickly, placing the document in front of her. The same one she had signed less than 2 hours ago. The same clean line, the same efficient closure, and Victoria looked at her own signature for a moment longer than she should have. Not because she doubted it, but because she understood it differently now. 3 strokes of ink, one decision, one life shifted, and the simplicity of it felt heavier than before, and she closed the folder slowly. "Call human resources," she said, and within seconds the line connected. "Yes, Miss Kane." A voice answered, alert, ready, and she paused just a fraction. The kind of pause no one in that building had ever heard from her. "Daniel Hayes," she said finally, "I want his file reviewed." And the voice on the other end responded without hesitation. The termination has already been processed, and Victoria's gaze lifted slightly, not sharp, not angry, just focused. Then process it again, she replied, calm but immovable, and the silence on the other end stretched just long enough to register the shift. Yes, ma'am. And the call ended. And for a moment, nothing moved, not the screens, not the air, not even the rhythm of the office beyond the glass walls, because something had changed, not in the system, but in the way she was standing inside it. And she turned back to the window, the city still moving beneath her, unchanged, unaware, and yet she could not shake the image of him walking out, the box in his hands, the absence of resistance, the absence of anger, the absence of everything she expected from someone who had just lost something that mattered. And that absence had weight, more weight than any argument, because it did not ask for anything. It simply existed, undeniable. And she spoke again, almost to herself. Why did he not say anything? And her assistant, standing just behind her, answered carefully, some people do not. And Victoria nodded once, the answer settling in a place she had not visited in a long time, because she had built her world on voices, on negotiations, on people who pushed back, who demanded, who leveraged every moment for advantage. But this was different. This was someone who had walked away without taking anything with him except his own sense of self, and that kind of quiet did not fit in her metrics. It did not calculate. It did not predict. It simply remained, and she turned back to her desk, picking up the termination folder once more. But this time it did not feel like a completed action. It felt like an interruption, something unfinished, something waiting. And as she placed it down, her reflection caught faintly in the dark screen beside it, composed, controlled, but no longer untouched. And she said, find him, not as a command to correct a mistake, but as something else, something closer to understanding. And the room held that moment in silence. Because this was not about reversing a decision anymore. It was about facing the weight behind it. And for the first time that morning, Victoria Kane was not ahead of the outcome. She was standing inside it. By mid-afternoon, the address came back clean, a small house on the edge of town, the kind of place that did not show up in headlines or investor briefings. And Victoria Kane stood beside the open car door for a moment longer than necessary. Her driver waiting, her assistant silent, the engine idling with a low, steady hum. We can call him in, the assistant suggested carefully. Have him come to the office. And Victoria shook her head once. No, she said, closing the door herself. I will go. 3 words, simple, final. And the car pulled away from the polished glass of the building into streets that did not reflect power, but carried life in quieter ways. And as the city shifted from steel to siding, from boardrooms to front porches, the rhythm changed, slower, less controlled. And Victoria watched it without speaking, because this was not a place she visited, not because she could not, but because she had never needed to, and the difference sat with her now, not as discomfort, but as awareness. And when the car stopped in front of the house, there was no gate, no guard, just a narrow driveway and a small porch with chip paint that had been fixed more than once by hands that chose function over appearance. And Victoria stepped out, the air warmer here, quieter, carrying the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block and the distant echo of children playing. And she stood there for a moment, looking at the place where Daniel Hayes lived, not as a concept, not as a line on a file, but as a life that continued whether she understood it or not. And before she could reach the door, it opened, not dramatically, not in surprise, just slowly. And Daniel stood there, sleeves rolled, a dish towel in his hand, as if he had been in the middle of something ordinary, something uninterrupted by the kind of decision she made every day. And their eyes met, and for a second, nothing was said, not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments do not begin with words, they begin with recognition. And Victoria spoke first, her voice steady, but different now. Mr. Hayes, she said, and he nodded once, not formally, not defensively, just acknowledging, Ms. Kane, he replied, calm, even, and there was no edge in it. No accusation, no attempt to remind her of anything she had done, and that absence again carried weight, more than any confrontation could have. And she took a step forward. I came to speak with you, she said, and Daniel glanced briefly over his shoulder, then back at her. Give me a minute, he replied. Simple. And he turned, leaving the door open just enough, and inside, Victoria could see a small kitchen. Clean, modest, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator with a magnet that had seen years of use, and the faint sound of a young voice asking something she could not fully hear, and Daniel answered softly. Something reassuring, something steady, and when he returned to the door, he stepped outside, closing it gently behind him, not shutting her out, just protecting what was inside, and he faced her again, hands relaxed at his sides. The same quiet presence, unchanged, and Victoria held his gaze, not as a CEO now, but as someone who had come to understand something she could no longer ignore. And she said, I made a decision this morning. And Daniel nodded once. I know, he replied, and she paused, feeling the weight of what came next, because this was not about authority anymore. This was about truth, and for the first time in a long time, Victoria Kane was not certain how her words would land, only that they needed to be said, and the air between them held still, not tense, not hostile, just waiting, like the moment before something real is finally spoken. Victoria held his gaze, steady but no longer distant. I reviewed your file, she said, her voice calm, measured, but carrying something new beneath it, and Daniel did not react, did not shift, he simply listened. There were things I did not see this morning, she continued, and he nodded once. Not an agreement, not an approval, just acknowledgement, and the quiet between them stretched, not uncomfortable, just honest, and she took a breath, not because she needed courage, but because she understood that words, once spoken here, would not be filtered by authority, only by truth. I made a mistake, she said, and the sentence landed without force, without defense, just clarity, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the air, not the sound of distant traffic, not even the rhythm of the world beyond the porch, because this was not the kind of apology Daniel Hayes was used to hearing, and yet he did not step into it, did not soften toward it. He simply stood there, grounded, present, and after a second he replied, that happens. 3 words, simple, without edge, without invitation, and Victoria felt it. Not rejection, not acceptance, just a boundary, one that did not need to be explained, to be understood. And she continued, I would like to correct it. And Daniel's eyes held hers, steady, thoughtful, and he asked quietly, what does that mean? And the question was not confrontational. It was precise like everything else about him, and she answered just as directly. I want to reinstate your position. And the words, in her world, usually closed conversations, restored order, resolved outcomes. But here, they did not land the same way. And Daniel was silent for a moment, not because he was considering the offer in the way she expected, but because he was measuring something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with salary or title. And he glanced briefly toward the door behind him, where the faint sound of Lily's voice drifted through, soft, unaware, and when he looked back, his expression had not hardened, had not changed. It had simply settled. I appreciate that, he said, calm, respectful, but I am not going back, and the sentence did not rise, did not push, it simply existed, firm and complete. And for the first time in this conversation, Victoria felt something shift in a way she could not immediately categorize, not resistance, not defiance, but something deeper, something that did not negotiate. And she spoke again, slower now. Is this about what happened? And Daniel shook his head once. It is about what it meant, he replied, and the distinction hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. And she studied him, trying to understand not the refusal itself, but the foundation beneath it, because in her world, everything had a point of leverage, a place where decisions could be adjusted. But here, there was none, and that absence carried more weight than any argument could. And Daniel continued, not to explain himself, but to be clear. You made your decision without knowing me, he said. That is your right. A brief pause. But respect is not something you reissue after it is taken. And the words settled between them. Not harsh, not emotional, just true. And Victoria did not interrupt, did not defend, because she understood now that this was not a negotiation. It was a reflection. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had not been said before, everything that had been overlooked. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria Kane stood in a moment. She could not control, only receive, and Daniel Hayes, without raising his voice, without asking for anything, had made something unmistakably clear. Victoria did not speak right away, not because she lacked words, but because for the first time in a long time, words felt insufficient, and she stood there on that small porch, the weight of his refusal settling not as a rejection, but as a mirror, reflecting something she had not examined in years. "I see," she said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of authority, carrying only acknowledgement, and Daniel nodded once. Not to agree, not to comfort, just to recognize that something had been understood, and the air between them shifted, not tense, not resolved, just clear like a sky after a storm where nothing is hidden anymore. And from inside the house, a small voice called, "Daddy, do you know where my notebook is?" And Daniel turned slightly, his attention moving instantly. "Naturally, top drawer, left side," he replied, steady. And there was a softness in that exchange that did not belong to boardrooms or decisions. Something simple, grounded, real. And when he turned back, Victoria saw it fully for the first time. Not just the man who had fixed her car, not just the employee she had dismissed, but the life he held together quietly, without recognition, without audience. And she spoke again, more carefully now. "You helped me last night," she said, not as a reminder, but as a statement she needed to place in the open, and Daniel met her gaze. "I helped someone who needed it," he replied, and the distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, because it removed her title, her power, her identity, leaving only the moment, the choice, the action, and Victoria felt it, not as a loss, but as a recalibration of something deeper, and she nodded once, absorbing it, letting it settle, because this was not about correcting him, it was about understanding him. And after a moment she said, "Then thank you." And the words were simple, but they were not transactional, not automatic, they were deliberate, placed carefully in a space that did not demand them. And Daniel inclined his head slightly, accepting them without expansion, without expectation, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, like a quiet agreement that did not need to be spoken aloud. And Victoria stepped back just slightly, not retreating, just acknowledging that the conversation had reached its natural edge, and she looked once more at the house, at the door, at the place where something steady lived beyond her reach. And she said, "If you ever need anything," then paused, catching herself, because she realized even as the words formed that they did not belong here, not in this space, not in this moment. And she stopped, letting the sentence fall away unfinished. And Daniel watched her, not correcting, not filling the silence, just allowing it to exist. And that silence said more than any offer could, because it made clear what could not be exchanged, what could not be restored, what simply was. And Victoria nodded once, a quiet gesture of understanding, and turned toward the driveway. Each step measured, not rushed, not delayed, just deliberate. And as she reached the car, she paused, her hand resting briefly on the door. And for a second, she looked back, not to change anything, not to ask again, but to remember, to hold the shape of this moment before it became something else. And Daniel stood where she had left him, unchanged, grounded, and the distance between them was not defined by space, but by something far more lasting, something neither of them would forget. And as Victoria stepped into the car and the door closed softly behind her, the world outside resumed its motion. But inside, something had shifted quietly, permanently, in a way that did not need to be announced to be real. The car moved slowly down the quiet street, the house growing smaller in the rear window. But the moment did not fade with distance. It stayed, settled somewhere deeper than memory, and Victoria Kane sat in silence, not checking her phone, not reviewing the next meeting, just looking ahead as the world resumed its usual rhythm around her. "Back to the office?" her driver asked softly, and she paused, then shook her head once. "Not yet," she replied, her voice calm, but changed, and the car continued forward without direction for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if even the road understood that something inside her had shifted course. And back at the house, Daniel Hayes stood for a moment after the car disappeared, not watching it leave, just standing in the quiet that followed. and then he turned, opened the door, and stepped back inside, where life had already continued without interruption. Lily sitting at the table, her notebook open, pencil in hand. "Did your friend need help?" she asked without looking up, and Daniel smiled faintly, setting the dish towel down. "She needed to understand something," he said, and Lily nodded as if that answer made perfect sense because to her it did, and he walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat beside her, looking at the page filled with small drawings and careful handwriting, something about planets and orbits, something about how things move without colliding when balance is right. And he pointed to a line she had drawn slightly off. "Try this," he said gently, adjusting it just enough. And she followed, correcting it, and the two of them sat there in that quiet rhythm, not thinking about what had been lost, only focused on what remained. And miles away, Victoria finally spoke again, not to her assistant, not to her driver, but to herself, barely above a whisper. He was right, and the words did not carry defeat. They carried clarity, the kind that does not come from being told, but from seeing. And when the car eventually turned back toward the city, the buildings rose again, familiar, structured, controlled, but they did not feel the same, not because they had changed, but because she had. And as she stepped back in her office, the screens lit up, the schedules resumed, the system continued, but she did not move immediately. She stood there, looking at it all, understanding now that efficiency without awareness leaves gaps, and gaps carry consequences that no system can correct after the fact. And she walked her desk, picked up the termination folder one last time, and instead of reopening it, she set it aside, not to erase what had happened, but to remember it. And the room, still filled with light, still precise, held a different kind of silence now. Not empty, not waiting, but settled, like something had finally found its place. And somewhere across town, in a small house with chipped paint and steady warmth, a father helped his daughter finish her homework, and neither of them knew that in a world far removed from theirs, something had been learned that could not be undone. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.